There was a time when the world was divided by more than just borders or beliefs. A time when the lands were ruled by towering castles, their stone walls standing like giants, casting long shadows over the fields below. These castles were not simply fortresses. They were symbols of the king's power so vast it reached into every corner of their kingdoms. Kings and queens, draped in luxurious robes, dined on feasts that would never be tasted by the hands that served them. Thrones, encrusted with jewels, sat upon the highest towers, where the rulers gazed over the land as though they were gods. These were the days when crowns meant not just sovereignty, but divinity. The lives of these kings were ones of grandeur, carved into history with every battle won, every castle built, and every alliance formed. They ruled vast territories, their names whispered across continents, etched into the pages of time as the true masters of the world. Their palaces were adorned with tapestries woven with threads of gold, and their banquet halls echoed with the laughter of nobles, their voices rising above the quiet murmur of the kingdom below. Here, in the warmth of the royal chambers, power seemed eternal, and the day's worries seemed as distant as the horizon itself. But as you stand outside the gilded halls of a medieval castle, the scene changes. Just beyond the gates, in the quiet corners of the land, the world is starkly different. While the king's chambers are bathed in candlelight, the peasant's hut shivers in the cold, its walls weak and brittle, barely holding the wind at bay. Beneath the soft carpets of royalty, the dirt beneath the feet of commoners clings to their shoes, their fingers rough from years of toil, from the weight of survival. The peasant, bending low to the earth, knows nothing of royal robes or jeweled crowns. For them, life is measured in seasons, in harvests, in the very soil that sustains them. They are bound not by the grandeur of a throne, but by the unyielding demands of the land and the will of their masters. There is a gulf between these worlds, a chasm so wide that it's hard to even imagine the lives of those at the top ever intersecting with those at the bottom. The king, in his castle, is a world apart from the peasant in his fields, and yet, without the peasant's back-breaking labor, the king's world would crumble. It is the peasant who tilled the soil, who harvested the grain, who labored tirelessly so that the king's table would never go bare. The work was endless, and the reward was minimal. Where the king's nights were filled with music and merriment, the peasant's evenings were filled with the crackling of cold firewood and the distant howls of wolves. But in the silence of the night, under the weight of their unseen labor, the peasants held a power of their own. It was a quiet power, one not born of gold or armies, but of survival. The king's power might have come from his lineage and his wealth, but it was the peasants' work that gave the kingdom its pulse. Their hands, though calloused and worn, built the world. Yet, their names would not be remembered by the scribes, their faces never captured in portraits hanging in the castle halls. History would favor the kings, the nobles, the conquerors. The peasants would remain in the shadows, their stories whispered only among those who knew the truth. The truth that power, in the medieval world, was never just about wealth or status. It was about labor. It was about who worked, who toiled, and who bled for the empire. While the king sat in his warmth, the peasant fought the cold. While the ruler's court was filled with music and fine wine, the peasant's world echoed with silence, broken only by the cries of hunger or the desperate prayers for a harvest to come. But as the years passed, as the kingdoms grew, and as the castles rose higher, something began to shift. A hidden world, a world of resistance and resilience, quietly began to take form in the corners of these vast kingdoms. Beneath the rule of kings, a different kind of power was brewing, a power that would go unnoticed for centuries, buried beneath layers of history. What if we told you that the true strength of the medieval world was never in the castles, nor in the crowns, but in the hands that worked the land? What if, hidden beneath the kings and queens, beneath the royal decrees and noble titles, there was a far more complex story waiting to be uncovered? As we peel back the layers of history, we begin to see how these forgotten workers, these silent builders, not only shaped the world they lived in, but paved the way for a revolution in how societies would one day be organized. But to understand this hidden history, we must first look deeper into the lives of those who never made it into the annals of royal courts. The peasants who endured hardship, yet lived with a quiet defiance that would go unnoticed by many for centuries to come. From the grand halls of kings to the humble huts of peasants, there is much more than meets the eye. And so, as we move forward in this journey, we will venture deeper into the forgotten world of those who were, perhaps, the true architects of the medieval kingdoms. While the king's grand feast echoed through the halls of his towering castle, the world outside was vastly different. Beneath the shadow of the royal banners, where knights rode proudly and merchants lined cobbled streets, there was a quiet undercurrent. It was here, in the silent fields and humble huts, that the true pulse of the kingdom beat unnoticed, yet vital to its very existence. The peasants, whose names were never written in the scrolls of history, carried the weight of the realm, unseen and unacknowledged. Life for the peasant was not one of ease or indulgence. There were no lavish dinners, no fine wine poured into golden chalices, no tapestries to admire. Instead, their world was shaped by the harsh rhythms of the seasons, by the soil beneath their feet, and by the unrelenting demands of survival. Each day, peasants woke with the sun, their bodies already weary from years of labor. The fields called, and there was no room for rest, not for them, not for their families. The work was constant, the burden unyielding. It wasn't merely physical labor, it was mental endurance, an unspoken understanding that life was a struggle and survival was a victory in itself. Despite the grinding hardships, there were moments of fragile solace. Around a modest hearth, the peasant's family would gather, their faces glowing from the flickering firelight. There were no gilded chalices, but the bread shared among them held a kind of sacredness. The humble cottage, far from being a symbol of poverty, was a fortress of sorts, a place where warmth could be found in both the food that nourished them and the love that bound them together. It was a rare and fleeting comfort, for there was always the looming threat of the next winter's cold or the uncertainty of the harvest. Yet, beneath these everyday struggles lay a deeper truth. The peasants were not simply survivors, they were the architects of the world in which the kings flourished. Their hands, worn from work, crafted the very foundation of society. The crops they grew fed the kingdom, the wool they spun clothed its people, and the timber they chopped built the homes of both royalty and commoners. But their lives, their contributions, were largely invisible to those who held power. The kings and their courts were quick to celebrate their triumphs, their battles won, but they rarely, if ever, turned their gaze down to see the hands that made it all possible. The stories of these workers, hidden in the cracks of time, are not simply the tales of people who toiled in silence. No, these were individuals who carried within them knowledge of the land, the stars, the plants that could heal, and the stories that could survive the dark. They passed this wisdom down not through books or grand lectures, but through the spoken word, in quiet whispers around campfires and within the walls of their homes. They understood the deep rhythms of the earth in ways that would never be captured in royal chronicles. They knew the secrets of survival in a world where everything could be lost to famine, plague, or war, and though the kings and nobles were blind to it, this knowledge was what kept the kingdom alive. There were secrets, too, that lived in the hearts of these peasants. Hidden customs and rituals passed down through generations, practices that the church and the monarchy feared because they were untamed, unregulated, and free. These secrets were not meant to be written down or shared with outsiders. They were the lifeblood of a people who understood that in a world of constant change, tradition was the one thing they could hold on to. The peasants, the forgotten ones, guarded these truths, passed them from parent to child, never knowing that one day they would be lost to time, erased from history's pages by the very rulers who depended on their labor. But what if we told you that these hidden practices were more than mere superstition? What if the wisdom of the peasants was not only about surviving the day-to-day grind, but about something much deeper? Something that, if fully understood, might challenge the very foundation of the power structures that ruled their world. The peasants knew things that the kings and queens did not. things about the world, about nature, and perhaps even about themselves. These secrets, tucked away in the corners of the kingdom, were whispers that dared not speak too loudly, for they threatened the established order. Still, for all their resilience, for all the knowledge they carried, the peasants remained invisible to the kings who ruled over them. The royal chronicles told of battles won and lands conquered, of alliances forged and treaties signed. But the real story, the story that truly made the kingdom run, was one that the kings erased, either out of ignorance or fear. In the shadow of the stone castles, where power was declared with a flourish of a royal seal, the peasants lived in a different world, a world where their names would not be remembered, but their labor would echo through the centuries. The hidden lives of these peasants reveal a truth we often overlook, that power is not always where we expect it to be. It is not always in the hands of the rulers or the generals. Sometimes, it is found in the quiet strength of those who never seek recognition, whose faces remain lost in the dust of time. The real kingdom, the true fabric of medieval life, was not built on the grandiose ambitions of kings, but on the unsung resilience of the workers who built their world, even while remaining hidden from view. As we move forward, we will uncover more of the world that the peasants knew, more of the secrets they carried, and more of the hidden networks that sustained their lives in the shadows of power. But first, we must understand the world that bound them, the feudal system, the land they worked, and the forces that shaped their daily lives. Only then can we begin to grasp the full complexity of their struggle, and the forgotten power they held in the depths of their quiet existence. In the medieval world, power was not simply a matter of wealth or military might, it was deeply rooted in land. The land itself, vast and unyielding, was the foundation of society, and those who controlled it held the reins of authority. At the top of this structure sat the king, a ruler whose word was law, whose domain stretched as far as the eye could see. Beneath him, a network of lords and barons, granted their own fiefdoms, ruled over the vast swaths of land that sprawled across the kingdom. And below them, bound by duty and necessity, were the peasants. These men and women were not free in the way we might think of freedom today. They were bound to the land in ways that would seem unimaginable to us, their lives dictated by a system that granted them no agency, no voice, and often no hope. The feudal system, as it was called, was a structure built on loyalty and military protection, an intricate web of allegiances and obligations. The king, the ultimate authority, granted large parcels of land to his most trusted followers, the lords and barons, in exchange for their loyalty and service. These lords, in turn, granted smaller portions of land to knights or vassals, men who pledged their sword and loyalty in exchange for a place to live and the right to extract labor from those beneath them. It was a system of mutual obligation, a structure designed to maintain order, provide protection, and, ultimately, keep the realm from falling into chaos. But for the peasant, this system was far from protective. Their role in this arrangement was not one of prestige, nor was it one of freedom. The land they worked was not their own, and the protection offered by their lords often came at a great cost. In exchange for the right to live on the land and farm it, peasants were required to give a portion of their harvest to their lord, leaving them with little to sustain themselves. The labor was relentless from dawn until dusk. They toiled in the fields, their hands rough and their backs sore. For many, there was no reprieve. They could not leave the land. To do so would be to risk starvation or worse. The land was not just the source of their survival, it was their prison, and the lord was their jailer. The feudal contract, as it were, might have been based on mutual loyalty, but in reality, it was a one-sided agreement. The lords held all the power, and the peasants were left with very little. What little freedom they had was a fragile illusion. Their rights were minimal, and their obligations to their lords were absolute. In exchange for the lord's protection, the peasant had to give up any claim to independence. It was a brutal bargain. While the lords enjoyed lavish lives, protected by their knights and attended to by servants, the peasants lived in small, drafty huts, their families struggling to make ends meet, and if they could not meet their obligations to their lord, If they failed to harvest enough grain or pay their dues, the punishment could be severe. Yet, despite the harshness of their reality, the peasants played a pivotal role in the medieval economy. The land they worked was the kingdom's lifeblood, and without them, it could not have functioned. They were the ones who tilled the fields, harvested the crops, and fed the kingdom. It was a labor that never stopped, a work that took every ounce of strength, but it was also a work that held the entire structure of society together. The lords, with their castles and their wealth, might have held power, but the peasants were the silent architects of the world in which the lords thrived. Without the peasants, the kingdom would have crumbled. The peasants' labor was the foundation of the realm's economy, but it was also the force that bound them to the land, a force that made it nearly impossible to escape. But despite the unyielding weight of the system, peasants did not simply submit. There was a quiet resistance woven into their lives, subtle acts of defiance that would go unnoticed by their lords, but that kept the spark of autonomy alive. Some refused to work the fields as directed, others took liberties with the harvest, hiding crops or diverting water to areas where their lord could not see. These small acts of rebellion, though often inconspicuous, were their way of carving out a little space for themselves within the harsh bounds of feudal society. Even in the most controlled systems, the human spirit finds ways to resist, to claim even the smallest piece of freedom. And these acts, though small, were the first whispers of change. The truth is, the system of feudalism was not as stable as it appeared. Beneath the surface, there were cracks in the foundation. The peasants, though often viewed as nothing more than laborers, held a kind of quiet power. It was not in their wealth, nor in their land, but in the resilience they showed in the face of adversity. The lords may have controlled the land, but it was the peasants who gave it life. Without their hands, the fields would be barren, the castles would be empty, and the lords would have nothing to protect. But that resilience came at a price. The relationship between lord and peasant was one of unbalanced power, a relationship that often led to exploitation. And so, while the peasants worked to sustain the kingdom, they remained at the mercy of their lords. This was a world where loyalty was not a two-way street, but a one-way avenue leading only toward the lord's wealth and power. As the years passed, the harsh realities of this system began to weigh heavier and heavier on the peasants. They were bound not just by their work, but by an invisible chain, a chain forged by centuries of tradition, by a social structure that dictated every aspect of their lives. And yet, as oppressive as the system was, it was this very system that would eventually give rise to something new. In the silent resistance of the peasants, in their struggle to survive and maintain their dignity, something began to shift. The chains that held them would not remain unbroken forever. The struggle for change was already taking root. But to understand how these peasants would eventually challenge the very system that bound them, we must first look at how they navigated the feudal system itself, how they survived, how they resisted, and how they began to find ways to reclaim what had long been taken from them. In the next section, we will delve into the subtle forms of resistance that shaped the medieval world, and how these acts of defiance laid the groundwork for the larger shifts to come. The feudal system, with its iron grip on both land and people, often seemed invincible. The peasants, bound to the land by duty and fear, appeared as little more than pawns in a game played by kings and lords. Yet, beneath the surface of this rigid social order, something stirred, something the lords could not fully control. In the silence of the night, when the fires burned low and the world seemed still, the peasants plotted. They did not always rebel with the loud cries of war or revolt. No, their resistance was often quieter, more insidious, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that the rulers could not easily stamp out. It was the quiet hum of defiance that would echo through the centuries, though many would never hear it. What if these rebellions were not simply the grand, violent uprisings we imagine when we think of resistance? What if, instead, they were whispers, small, subtle, strategic acts of defiance that were often overlooked, buried, or erased by those in power? These acts of rebellion, though small in scale, were far from insignificant. They were the seeds of a larger resistance that would grow, unseen by many, and would eventually reshape the world they lived in. The peasants might not have had the weapons or the armies to overthrow the lords, but they had something more powerful: their wit, their resilience, and their ability to resist in ways that left no trace. At first glance, life for the peasants seemed to offer little opportunity for rebellion. Their days were consumed with labor, and their nights were spent in the cold, their lives bound by an unspoken code of survival. But within the constraints of this existence, there were subtle ways to fight back. They could sabotage the work of their lords without ever being caught. A poorly tilled field, a misdirected harvest, the occasional act of stealing a few grains of wheat. These were all small acts, but they carried with them a sense of power. Power, in a system where everything was designed to strip it away. The peasants, though they might never have been able to take up arms, fought back in ways that required far more than mere physical strength. They fought with quiet strategy and subtle resistance, knowing that even the smallest act of defiance could disrupt the larger system. In some places, the peasants created hidden communities, small enclaves, where they could find refuge from the demands of their lords. These communities were often built in remote areas, tucked away in forests or hills, where the reach of the lord's eyes could not extend. Here, the peasants could live with a semblance of autonomy, away from the strict hierarchies and oppressive rules that governed their daily lives. In these secret spaces, they maintained their own customs, their own ways of living, their own forms of spirituality. These hidden communities were, in essence, rebellions against the feudal system itself. They were havens where the peasants could breathe freely, if only for a short time, before returning to the grueling labor that awaited them. Yet, these acts of rebellion were not celebrated in the history books. In fact, they were often erased from the annals of time. Those who led these movements were vilified, their names erased or forgotten, and their efforts cast aside as unworthy of remembrance. It was far easier for the kings and lords to write their history as one of order and control, than to acknowledge the quiet uprisings that had been brewing in the shadows. These rebellions, though they did not always lead to open warfare, were powerful in their own right. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the determination of those who, despite having nothing, would still find ways to push back. One of the more famous instances of peasant resistance, though it too would eventually be dismissed as a mere footnote in history, was the Jacquerie times in 1358, a brutal peasant revolt in France. The uprising was sparked by the crushing burdens placed on the peasants by their lords, exacerbated by the chaos of the 100 Years' War. While it ended in violent suppression, the revolt was not a solitary event. It was part of a long history of insurrection, a quiet undercurrent of rebellion that had simmered beneath the surface for centuries. The Jacquerie times was not an isolated incident. It was merely one chapter in a longer, forgotten tale of resistance. But even in the aftermath of these uprisings, the resistance never truly disappeared. Instead, it took on different forms. The peasants learned to work within the system, to find ways to subtly defy the lords while still appearing obedient. They understood the power of invisibility, how, by remaining unnoticed, they could undermine the entire system. They began to adopt strategies of passive resistance, using silence as their weapon. They spoke in riddles, in codes, in whispers that the lords could never fully understand. They learned how to survive in the cracks, to work the system in ways that allowed them to preserve their dignity and, in some small way, their freedom. But why, then, do we not know more about these stories? Why, in the grand sweep of history, do the voices of the peasants remain so quiet? The truth is that the stories of resistance were often erased by the very systems that sought to maintain control. The records that came down to us were written by the victors, by the kings, the lords, the church, and they had little interest in preserving the stories of those who fought against them. The peasants who led these rebellions were often labeled as criminals, their efforts dismissed as the desperate actions of a powerless class. But the reality is more complicated. These movements were born from a deep, unspoken knowledge that the system could not and would not last forever. The The small rebellions that unfolded in the shadows were the true heartbeat of resistance. While the kings and lords fought their grand battles on the battlefield, the peasants fought a different kind of war, one that was quiet, hidden, and, ultimately, more enduring. These rebellions, though they may have been forgotten, continue to resonate. The very fabric of resistance in the face of oppression was woven by those who had no power, no wealth, and no voice. And yet, they changed the course of history, quietly, without fanfare. As we move forward, we will see how these hidden rebellions were not just acts of defiance, they were the seeds of a larger cultural and spiritual movement, one that would eventually challenge the very structure of medieval society. The next chapter will reveal how the peasants, though their power may have seemed limited, found ways to fight back in ways far deeper than mere revolt. They fought for their minds, their spirits, and their culture, setting the stage for the shifts to come. In the unforgiving world of medieval peasants, where each day was a struggle against the elements, famine, and the will of their lords, survival was a far more complex matter than simply finding enough to eat. It was a psychological battle as much as a physical one. And in that battle, one tool stood above all others: faith. For the peasants, religion was not just a spiritual practice or a set of beliefs to be followed. It was a lifeline, an essential means of survival, a psychological shield that helped them endure even the darkest days. The harshness of medieval life left little room for comfort. The cold, the hunger, the constant work in the fields, these were the everyday burdens they bore. But it was the times of crisis, when plague swept through the villages or famine laid waste to entire crops, that truly tested their endurance. In these moments, when the physical world seemed to offer no mercy, faith became their refuge. It was a balm for their suffering, a way to make sense of a world that often seemed senseless. They believed that by clinging to faith, they could weather the storms of life, whether those storms came in the form of disease, war, or the unpredictable whims of nature. Faith, then, became more than just a belief in an afterlife or divine intervention. It was a daily tool of survival. It shaped how peasants viewed their world, their hardships, and themselves. The rituals of religion were woven into every part of their lives. The ringing of church bells marked the hours of their days. Prayers punctuated their work in the fields, offering brief moments of escape and peace. They believed that by living according to the teachings of the church, they could endure their hardships and perhaps even be rewarded in the life to come. But survival through faith was not simply an act of passive endurance. It was a means of coping with the overwhelming powerlessness peasants felt in their daily lives. When famine struck, they prayed for their crops to grow. When plague descended, they turned to the church for comfort and hope, even as the death toll climbed higher and higher. It was in the church that they found solace, not only from the horrors of the present, but from the fear of what lay beyond this world. The promise of salvation, the hope of eternal life in the presence of God, was a powerful motivator, and perhaps the only thing that gave them the strength to continue. In a world filled with suffering, the church gave peasants a sense of order, a structure to hang their lives on. It told them that there was meaning to their struggles, that their suffering was not in vain. When the world seemed to have no answers, the church offered them an explanation. Suffering was a test of faith, a purging of sin, a path to redemption. The peasants could not control the forces that shaped their lives, but through faith, they could find meaning in their suffering, and that, in itself, gave them the strength to endure. But the relationship between peasants and the church was far from simple. While faith provided comfort and hope, the church also wielded immense power over the lives of the peasants. It was not just a spiritual authority, it was a political force, a social institution with vast wealth and influence. The church held sway over the lives of the common folk, shaping their understanding of the world, their place in it, and their obligations to those in power. The promises of salvation were not freely given, they came at a price. The church demanded obedience, and with it, control. The peasants were taught to fear God's judgment, to fear damnation, and to believe that their suffering was part of a divine plan. They were told that their earthly hardships were a test of their faith, a means of earning their place in heaven. In exchange for this promise, the church required their loyalty, their tithes, and their labor. The church was a source of comfort and salvation, but it was also a force of control, a tool by which the powers of the time could maintain their grip on the peasants. And yet, beneath this facade of piety and obedience, there were those who secretly questioned the church, who began to see the contradictions within its teachings. While the peasants were encouraged to be humble and accept their suffering, the church's wealth and power grew, further entrenching the divide between the rulers and the ruled. In a society where everything was dictated by the church and the state, it was difficult for the peasants to voice their doubts or openly rebel against the system. But this didn't mean they accepted their place without question. There were whispers of dissent, hushed conversations in the corners of humble cottages, where peasants questioned the church's teachings and the motives behind its promises. The peasants may have clung to their faith for survival, but many began to see it as something more than just a means of enduring hardship. It became a tool for questioning the very system that had kept them bound to the land. And in their hearts, they began to wonder, was their suffering truly ordained by God, or was it simply the result of the oppressive structures that ruled their lives? As the centuries passed, these quiet acts of rebellion, these questions about the role of the church and the legitimacy of its authority, would slowly begin to bubble to the surface. The foundations of the church's control, which had been so deeply entrenched in medieval society, began to crack. The peasants' faith, once a source of survival, would eventually evolve into something far more complex, a means of challenging the power structures that had kept them in chains. In the next chapter, we will explore how this tension between faith and control gave rise to new forms of resistance, how peasants began to carve out their own spiritual paths, and how they found ways to subvert the very institution that had promised them salvation. But for now, it is important to understand that for the medieval peasant, faith was never simply about divine worship. It was about survival, a survival that went beyond the physical and touched the very core of their existence. Faith was not just a weapon against despair, it was the thread that held them together in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. In the shadow of the towering cathedrals and the grandeur of church authority, a different kind of faith quietly pulsed through the veins of medieval society. For the peasants, bound by the rigid teachings of the church, faith was not merely something practiced in the light of day. It was something lived in the hidden corners of their world, a faith that flourished in the darkness, far from the watchful eyes of priests and kings. The official religion, the one that promised salvation, was just one part of the story. Beneath the surface of Christianity's doctrines, the peasants held on to their own beliefs, older and more primal than anything the church could offer, beliefs that connected them not just to God, but to the earth, to their ancestors, and to the land they worked so tirelessly. These hidden beliefs, often dismissed as superstition or heresy, were not merely remnants of a forgotten past. They were a lifeline, a means of resistance, a way for the oppressed to reclaim their power in a world where everything was designed to strip them of it. Folk traditions, rooted in paganism, were passed down in whispers and secret gatherings. They were the rituals of the earth, the seasons, and the forces of nature that the peasants had lived with long before the church arrived to reshape their world. The church, with its promise of salvation, may have dominated the surface of peasant life, but the older faiths ran deep beneath the soil, like the roots of the trees they tended. These were the beliefs that linked the peasants to the cycles of nature, the sowing of seeds, the harvest, the turning of the seasons, and the inevitable death that followed life. For the peasants, nature was not just a backdrop to their lives, it was sacred. The earth, the wind, the trees, and the waters all held power. And while the church preached obedience to God, the peasants found their connection to the divine in the land they worked, in the stars above, and in the rituals passed down through generations. These hidden beliefs were not just about connecting to the land, they were also a means of connecting to the past, to a time when their ancestors had lived by different rules, when the world had been ruled not by kings and priests, but by the forces of nature and the spirits of the earth. The peasants did not forget their roots. They clung to the old ways, even as the church tried to stamp them out, and in doing so, they kept a link to a world beyond the tyranny of feudalism and the rigid constraints of Christian dogma. The rituals and symbols of these hidden beliefs were simple, often performed in the privacy of the home or in secluded groves far from the eyes of the clergy. These were not grand ceremonies performed in grand cathedrals. They were personal acts, intimate and deeply connected to the rhythms of everyday life. The peasants knew how to read the omens in the weather, how to use herbs to heal, how to call on the spirits for protection. They spoke to the trees, to the animals, and to the elements as if they were living beings, understanding that their survival depended not just on their labor, but on the forces of nature that could never be tamed by the church or the lords. One of the most powerful aspects of these hidden beliefs was the reverence for ancestors. In a world where death was a constant presence, where plague and famine claimed lives with frightening regularity, the memory of the dead became a source of strength. The peasants believed that their ancestors were never truly gone. They lived on in the earth, in the air, and in the very fabric of life itself. To honor the ancestors was not just a spiritual act, it was a way of asserting continuity, a reminder that the cycle of life was unbroken. While the church promised eternal life in heaven, the peasants believed that their ancestors walked beside them, offering guidance and protection from the unseen world. But these beliefs, as powerful as they were also dangerous. The church, with its tight grip on medieval society, saw these folk traditions as a threat to its authority. To believe in anything other than the doctrines of the church was heresy, and those who practiced these hidden faiths risked being branded as witches, heretics, or sorcerers. Many were persecuted, forced to renounce their beliefs, or face the flames of the Inquisition. The church's power over the lives of the peasants was not just a matter of theology, it was a matter of control. By stamping out these old beliefs, the church sought to consolidate its power over the peasants' minds, bodies, and souls. But for all its efforts to suppress these beliefs, the church could not fully erase them. They lingered in the corners of the peasants' world, passed down through secret rituals, whispered in the dark, and hidden away in the hearts of those who had nothing else to hold on to. The peasants may have been told to bow before the priests and follow the commandments of the church, but their true faith was one that could not be confined by doctrine. It was a faith that could not be extinguished by fire or by fear, because it was rooted in the earth itself, in the land that had sustained them for generations. What if the faith that kept the peasants alive, that gave them strength in the face of hardship, was not the one they prayed to in public, but the one they kept hidden in the secret places of their hearts? What if their true connection to the divine was not through the rituals of the church, but through the cycles of the seasons, the whisper of the wind, and the songs of their ancestors? These secret faiths were not just a relic of a past age. They were a testament to the resilience of the oppressed, to the power of belief in a world where nothing was certain. They were the quiet defiance of a people who, though beaten and broken by the systems that sought to control them, refused to surrender the core of their identity. The faith of the peasants was a flame that could not be extinguished, even by the mighty power of the church. As we move forward, we will delve into the darker aspects of medieval life, the plagues, the death, and the suffering that drove many to seek solace in these hidden beliefs. In the next chapter, we will explore how these hidden rituals and the deep connection to the land provided a means of psychological survival in a world that offered little hope. But for now, it's important to understand that these secret faiths were not just about resistance, they were the means by which the peasants endured, by which they found meaning and strength in a world that seemed to offer neither. The medieval world was a place where survival was never guaranteed. Beneath the towering castles and bustling market squares, peasants fought an unrelenting battle against forces far beyond their control. Epidemics and famines swept across Europe like storms, leaving devastation in their wake. The chroniclers of the time, with their noble pens and lofty ideals, often left out the true cost of these disasters, the human toll, the silent suffering of those who lived in the shadows of history. What did they leave out? The peasants didn't just survive the plague, they hid from it too. Plague, famine, and disease were not rare interruptions in the lives of peasants. They were the rhythm of existence. Imagine living in a world where death lurked at every turn, where the next cough, the next fever, could be your last. The Black Plague, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, is perhaps the most infamous of these catastrophes. It tore through villages, cities, and fields, claiming the lives of millions. Whole families were wiped out in the span of days, leaving nothing but empty homes and grief-stricken survivors. But the plague was not an isolated event. It was part of a cycle of epidemics that seemed to plague the peasants more than anyone else. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, all swept through communities with the swiftness of a wildfire, cutting down anyone who had not yet succumbed to starvation or disease. The peasants, already struggling to survive the harsh realities of feudal life, now faced a new, invisible enemy. In the face of such a relentless onslaught, they were forced to adapt. But adaptation was not always enough. When the plague struck, there were no doctors, no medicines, and no way of escaping its reach. The best the peasants could do was to isolate themselves, to retreat into the small, dark corners of their homes, hoping that the disease would pass them by. Villages were torn apart by death, and whole families were wiped out overnight. In some places, the dead were simply piled into mass graves, their bodies not even given the dignity of a proper burial. The living were left with nothing but fear and the ghostly presence of those who had perished. The psychological toll of these plagues was as deep as the physical. Imagine the terror that gripped the heart of a peasant when the first signs of sickness appeared, the cold sweats, the painful fevers, the unbearable ache of the body, and even more terrifying was the uncertainty. Who would be next? Who would survive? And who would be taken by the invisible killer that swept through the villages? The terror was not just from the disease itself, but from the complete powerlessness it brought with it. The peasants were used to hardship, to toil, to the physical strain of working the land. But the plague was different. It was a disease that didn't care about the strength of a person's hands or the calluses on their skin. It struck down the young and the old, the strong and the weak, without distinction. It mocked their faith, their labor, and their survival instincts. In the wake of such devastation, the scars of the plague and other epidemics remained long after the death tolls had been counted. The fear of sickness became an integral part of daily life. The peasants no longer just feared hunger or war, they feared the very air they breathed. What was once a community, a village where neighbors helped one another, was now a place of suspicion and silence. The fear of contagion turned families against one another. Friends who had once shared meals would now cross the street to avoid contact. The bonds of social life were strained to the breaking point. In some cases, entire villages simply disappeared, abandoned by the survivors who could not bear the weight of grief and fear any longer. But it was not just the plague that left its mark. Famine, too, was a constant companion in the peasants' world. The harvests were never certain. There were years when crops failed, when the rains did not come, or when the frost struck too early, leaving the fields barren and the granaries empty. Famine, like disease, took its toll not just on the body, but on the mind. Starvation twisted the senses, leaving the peasants weak, delirious, and desperate. It created a kind of madness, a terror that gnawed at the soul as much as it did at the body. Those who survived the worst famines often carried their scars in the form of broken bodies, empty eyes, and haunted memories. But the peasants, for all the suffering they endured, were not passive victims. They had learned to survive in a world where death was never far away. They adapted, they fought, and they resisted. Though they could not stop the plague or prevent the famine, they found ways to endure. They turned to their faith, their secret beliefs, and the strength of their communities. They hid from the plague as much as they could, retreating into the shelter of their homes or the safety of the forest, away from the infected towns. They relied on their knowledge of the land, the plants that could heal, the herbs that could ward off illness, the rituals that connected them to their ancestors and the earth itself. They did not have the luxury of waiting for help from the outside world. They had to rely on themselves, on each other, and on the land that had both nourished and betrayed them. Through it all, the peasants carried on. They endured the ravages of the plague and famine, not just through physical endurance, but through a quiet, unspoken resilience. It was this resilience that allowed them to rebuild their lives, to repopulate their villages, and to continue working the land. Though the plague and the famine had taken so much from them, they did not let it take everything. They held on to their faith, their hidden beliefs, and the knowledge that the land, despite its cruelty, was still theirs to work. It was their connection to the earth that kept them alive, even when everything else seemed to be crumbling around them. But these scars, both physical and psychological, would last far longer than the plague itself. They became part of the peasant's psyche, a quiet trauma that would echo down through the generations. The impact of disease and famine was not just measured in death, but in the toll it took on the collective memory and spirit of a people. The next chapter will explore how these unspoken legacies of survival shaped the future, as the peasants began to rebuild, recover, and, eventually, challenge the very systems that had caused so much suffering. In the shadow of pandemics and famine, amidst the ashes of entire villages and the ruins of lives lost to disease, there were those who survived. These survivors, though their names were rarely written in the history books, played an indispensable role in the rebuilding of society after the catastrophic events that decimated the medieval world. While chroniclers and kings celebrated victories in battle, the silent work of the peasants went unnoticed, their contributions often relegated to the margins of history. But in truth, it was these survivors who laid the foundations for the world that would follow. Asterisk. When the world forgot their names, they rebuilt it anyway. Asterisk. The survivors of the plagues and famines were more than just the last to stand amidst the devastation. They were the ones who rebuilt the very fabric of society from the ground up. They did not have grand armies or impressive wealth to wield. What they had was resilience. They were the ones who planted crops again when the fields had been scorched by drought, who harvested what little remained when famine had eaten away at the land. They were the ones who returned to the earth with knowledge passed down through generations, knowing that without it, there could be no tomorrow. It is easy to overlook the importance of these survivors when we focus only on the larger narratives of history, the kings, the battles, the treaties. But society, in its most basic form, is built on the labor and the perseverance of those whose names are forgotten. These peasants did not hold power, nor did they demand recognition. They were the unseen hands, the workers who toiled under the brutal conditions of feudal life. Yet without them, nothing would have survived. It was their knowledge of the land, of the seasons, of ancient agricultural practices that allowed for the renewal of life after death. They knew how to coax a plant from barren soil, how to create irrigation systems from nothing, how to store food to survive the harsh winters. These were skills honed through hardship, passed down in whispered teachings and quiet exchanges, from mother to child, from neighbor to neighbor. The survivors also contributed to the revitalization of trade and knowledge, even as much of the learned world crumbled beneath the weight of plagues. Trade routes, once choked off by the violence and chaos of war, were slowly reopened, and the survivors, now seen as the last link in a broken chain, worked to re-establish the flow of goods across the land. The rebuilding of these trade networks was not done by kings sitting on golden thrones, but by those who had lived through the worst of humanity's trials and knew the value of both survival and cooperation. The medieval economy, once shattered, began to pulse again, its lifeblood flowing through the hands of the very people who had been considered disposable by the elites. In the aftermath of devastation, the survivors also played a crucial role in preserving knowledge. While the church, with its vast libraries and influence, struggled to retain control over the flow of information, the peasants preserved their own forms of wisdom, drawn from the earth and the stars, passed through generations, hidden from the eyes of those in power. Though much of the learning of the ancient world had been lost during the plague, the survivors carried forward knowledge in ways that history has often ignored. They were the keepers of herbal remedies, the bearers of folk wisdom, and the stewards of agricultural techniques that were the foundation of a new beginning. The church, for all its power, could not fully erase the peasants' connection to the land, nor could it completely quash the stories, remedies, and rituals that had sustained the people for centuries. While the official histories chronicled the triumphs of the kings, the wisdom of the peasants, their practical knowledge, their connection to the cycles of nature, and their ability to survive when the world seemed to have turned against them was what ultimately allowed society to rise again. This knowledge would later fuel the Renaissance, as it was the practical, lived experience of survival and adaptation that would shape the future of agriculture, medicine, and trade. The survivors also rebuilt society's emotional and cultural foundations. After so much loss, the survivors found strength in community. The bonds that had once been formed out of necessity, neighbors working together to till the land, to protect one another from the dangers of disease and famine, became the foundation for future generations. The social fabric, while strained, held together. In the face of trauma, the survivors sought out meaning in shared rituals, in the faith that connected them to something greater than themselves. And although the larger systems of power, the monarchy, the church often sought to control these practices, they could not erase the resilience and hope of the people who had suffered through the worst of it. But for all the resilience and rebuilding, these survivors remained largely invisible. Their contributions were not recognized, their names not written down in the records of history. They lived in the margins of society, their stories relegated to the shadows of time. The elite, in their pursuit of wealth and power, did not stop to acknowledge those who had been the true architects of survival. The peasants were the unsung heroes, their efforts swept away by the narrative of kings and conquerors. And yet, without them, the very foundation of the medieval world would have crumbled. As we move forward in this exploration, we will look deeper into how the survivors' hidden contributions laid the groundwork for the future. We will see how these forgotten people, often dismissed, erased from history, were not just the victims of tragedy, but the ones who ultimately shaped the course of history. The next chapter will shift focus to the legacy of these survivors, as we explore how their quiet resilience influenced future generations, from the struggles they faced in rebuilding to the knowledge they passed on. The impact of their survival was not only seen in their immediate recovery, but in the ways their strength and wisdom carried through to future generations. In the aftermath of centuries of plague, famine, and war, the medieval world had been left in a shattered state. Great empires crumbled, cities lay in ruins, and entire populations were decimated. But there was one group that had quietly been holding the fabric of society together, the peasants. Though their status was low, and their contributions often ignored, it was the labor, knowledge, and resilience of the peasant class that would ultimately lay the foundations for what would become the Renaissance. Asterisk. What if the foundations of modern civilization were built on the backs of the forgotten? Asterisk. It is a striking truth, one that history has often overlooked. The grand stories of kings, queens, and conquerors dominate the annals of history, while the daily toil of the peasants who provided the very lifeblood of society has been relegated to the margins. Yet, without the peasants, there would have been no harvest to feed the populations, no stone to build the castles, and no roads to connect the cities. They were the invisible architects of the medieval world, their hands shaping the land, their sweat nurturing the crops, and their perseverance keeping the wheels of society in motion. While the kings and nobility sat in their castles and courts, protected by their wealth and armies, the peasants were the ones who lived at the very edge of survival. Their work was grueling, unglamorous, and often went unnoticed. Yet, it was through their tireless efforts that the key elements of medieval society, agriculture, architecture, and trade, began to re-establish themselves in the aftermath of the destruction. The peasants, driven by necessity, passed on critical knowledge from generation to generation, adapting to the land in ways that allowed society to recover and rebuild. Agriculture, in particular, was the cornerstone upon which all else rested. The devastation of the Black Plague and other disasters had left fields abandoned and crops untended, but the peasants returned to the soil with a fierce determination. They knew how to coax life from barren earth, how to replant and rejuvenate the land. They used old, time-tested methods of crop rotation, soil preservation, and irrigation to ensure that the land would produce again. The techniques that the peasants refined were not only about survival, they were the building blocks of future agricultural advancements. Over time, as the population slowly rebounded, agriculture grew more productive, paving the way for a future where cities could thrive and trade could flourish. The peasants were also the unsung laborers behind the architectural feats that began to emerge in the wake of the devastation. Castles, fortresses, churches, and town walls all required skilled workers, and many of these workers were peasants. The art of building, of shaping stone and timber, was something that the peasants had learned through generations of labor. They worked the quarries, crafted the bricks, and laid the foundations for the grand structures that would come to symbolize power and prestige. The great cathedrals, with their towering spires, were not just the products of architects or nobles. They were the fruits of the peasants' labor, their strength, and their skill. These magnificent structures, which would go on to define the skyline of Europe, were built from the same hands that tilled the soil, harvested the grain, and cared for the land. Trade, too, was reborn out of the ashes of the past. In the wake of the plagues and famines, the peasants played a crucial role in the re-establishment of trade networks. The cities, though decimated, were not abandoned entirely. The survivors, including many peasants, began to rebuild the essential infrastructure of commerce. Roads were cleared, markets reopened, and goods began to flow again. Peasants were the backbone of this revival, providing not only food and raw materials but also acting as intermediaries in local and regional trade. They traded grain, livestock, and textiles, the very goods that had once been in short supply but were now essential to the growing urban centers. In time, the trade networks that stretched across Europe began to hum once again, with peasants at the heart of this vital exchange. This process of rebuilding was not just about the restoration of material wealth, it was also about the passing down of knowledge. As the medieval world staggered back to its feet, the peasants retained valuable knowledge that was passed from one generation to the next, knowledge that would become the foundation of later developments. They understood the land, the seasons, and the practical sciences of survival in ways that were not immediately visible but were critical to society's ability to recover. They knew how to harness the natural world, how to make the earth yield its fruits, and how to use local resources in ways that the elites, so often disconnected from the land, did not. Over time, these methods would evolve and lay the groundwork for the agricultural revolution that would take place centuries later. The tools of the peasants, the plough, the sickle, the wheelbarrow, were refined and improved upon, and new techniques emerged that allowed for more efficient production. These advancements, while often dismissed in their time, would eventually contribute to the social changes that would pave the way for the Renaissance. The peasants' labor was not just about survival, it was about laying the foundation for a new world, one that would eventually give rise to urbanization, trade, and cultural exchange. But for all the peasants' contributions, their efforts were rarely acknowledged. They worked tirelessly, rebuilt societies, and gave their blood, sweat, and tears. But their stories were seldom told. Their names were forgotten, their faces erased from the records of history. Yet, without them, the world would have been a much different place. The elites, with their wealth and their power, may have shaped the course of politics, but it was the peasants who created the very conditions in which those politics could unfold. They were the true builders of the medieval world, and their contributions would lay the groundwork for the cultural flowering of the Renaissance. As we continue our exploration, we will move into the next chapter, where we will delve deeper into how this foundational knowledge and resilience were passed on, how the legacy of the peasants' survival shaped future generations, and how it led to the flowering of ideas, art, and intellectual thought. The legacy of these forgotten builders is not just a tale of the past, but a living testament to the enduring power of resilience, survival, and the quiet strength of those who have been overlooked by history. The peasants of the medieval world were not just laborers, struggling to survive in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Beneath the surface of their daily toil, they were also keepers of knowledge, artisans, and craftsmen, whose work would ripple through history in ways that few would ever recognize. While the grand records of history focused on the lives of kings, nobles, and conquerors, the true creativity, innovation, and artistry of the time often found its expression in the hands of the common folk. Asterisk. The history books wrote them out, but their art, craft, and secrets lived on. Asterisk. The peasants' contributions to the arts and crafts were not born of luxury or leisure. They were born of necessity, the need to create functional tools, to build homes, to make clothes, and to feed their families. Yet, from these simple needs arose a wealth of skill and ingenuity that was passed down through generations, often in secret, away from the eyes of the powerful. These were the hidden treasures of medieval life, unrecorded in royal annals, but essential to the survival and advancement of society. In the fields, peasants were not just farmers, they were horticulturists, innovators in the art of crop rotation, plant breeding, and soil conservation. They learned the land's language in a way the elites could never fully understand. The peasants knew how to coax life from the earth, how to make the most of a harsh season, how to preserve food for times when the harvests were thin. These techniques, honed over centuries, were the foundation of agricultural advancement. They passed them down orally, teaching their children and their neighbors, not with books or formal education, but through the practical knowledge of the land. But the peasants' knowledge was not confined to the fields. The same ingenuity that allowed them to survive famine and disease also found its way into the crafting of everyday tools, objects, and art. The peasants made everything from furniture to utensils, from textiles to pottery, and each piece was a testament to their skill. Their craft was functional, yes, but it was also beautiful in its simplicity. The decorative designs that adorned their pottery, the intricate stitching of their clothing, the carved woodwork of their furniture, these were not just utilitarian objects, but expressions of creativity and artistry born out of necessity. Some of the most remarkable examples of peasant craft were the tools they made simple, sturdy, and functional. The peasants created plows, sickles, spades, and axes with an understanding of both form and function that allowed their designs to withstand the test of time. These tools were essential to the daily life of the peasant, but they were also a reflection of the deep connection the peasants had to the land. The craftsmanship that went into each piece was an act of respect for the earth that sustained them, and a mark of the skill that was honed through years of labor. As the peasants crafted these tools, they also began to pass down their knowledge of science and engineering, though in ways that were not formally recognized. They knew the secrets of water management, of building structures that could withstand the elements, of harnessing natural resources in ways that the nobility far removed from the land could never truly grasp. The peasants knew how to create rudimentary irrigation systems, how to build homes that would stay warm in winter and cool in summer. They understood the forces of nature, the winds, the rains, the earth beneath their feet, and they learned to work with these forces, not against them. This knowledge, while not recorded in books or scrolls, formed the bedrock of future scientific advancements. As Europe began to recover from the crises of the medieval period, the seeds of scientific exploration were already planted by these forgotten artisans. The very systems of agriculture and engineering that peasants had perfected would later provide the foundation for the technological revolutions that would transform society. Similarly, the peasants were also the bearers of the folk traditions and stories that made up the cultural fabric of the medieval world. These stories, passed down through oral tradition, often dealt with the mysteries of life, the cycles of nature, and the unseen forces that governed the world. Though these stories were considered folklore by the elites, they were essential to the peasants' understanding of their place in the world. The tales they told around the hearth of spirits in the forest, of the changing seasons, of gods and ancestors, were not just entertainment. They were a way for peasants to make sense of their world, to understand their place in it, and to pass on lessons learned from years of hardship and survival. These myths and stories, often dismissed as simple superstition, were the cultural treasures of the peasant class. They carried the wisdom of generations, preserving a worldview that was deeply connected to nature, to the land, and to the unseen forces that shape life. These traditions would later be absorbed into the broader cultural movements of Europe, even though their origins lay in the hands of the common folk. The cultural resurgence of the Renaissance, which sought to reconnect with the knowledge and wisdom of the ancient world, would find echoes in the hidden myths and stories passed down through the generations of peasants. Their influence, though indirect, would ripple through the art, literature, and thought that would define Europe's cultural rebirth. Even in literature, the peasants made their mark. Though the great works of literature were largely penned by the educated elite, the stories and folktales of the peasantry found their way into the broader literary tradition. The medieval ballads and songs, full of hidden meaning and allegory, captured the struggles, the joys, and the wisdom of the peasant class. These were stories of survival, of triumph against the odds, of enduring hardship with dignity. They may not have been written in the same refined prose as the works of the nobility, but their raw, unpolished beauty spoke to a deeper truth, one that resonated with the lived experiences of the common people. While these contributions to art, craft, and knowledge were largely left out of the official historical record, they were not without their impact. The skills and traditions passed down by the peasants would eventually become the foundation of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The craftsmanship of the peasants, their attention to detail, their deep understanding of the land, and their innovative spirit laid the groundwork for the technological and cultural advancements that would follow. As we continue our journey, we will see how these hidden contributions of the peasants were not just the echoes of a forgotten past. They were the living, breathing foundation upon which future generations would build their own advances in science, art, and knowledge. In the next chapter, we will explore the cultural and mythic legacy that these peasants left behind, the enduring impact of their stories and traditions, and how they helped shape the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, far from the bustling courts of kings and the grand halls of the church, the peasants wove their own truths. These truths were not written in books or etched in stone, but were passed down through the generations in whispered stories, in songs sung around fires, and in the hushed murmurs of the village square. These were the myths, stories of hidden lands, powerful ancestors, and forgotten gods. To those who listened closely, these myths were far more than fanciful tales. They were a way of making sense of a world that seemed often cruel, unforgiving, and beyond comprehension. Asterisk. The myths they told were more than stories, they were the truth they couldn't speak. Asterisk. The peasants, whose lives were shaped by nature's unforgiving rhythms and the harsh realities of feudal life, created these myths not just to entertain, but to explain the inexplicable. When disease swept through their villages, when the harvests failed, or when the bitter winds of winter turned their homes into icebound prisons, the peasants turned to stories to make sense of it all. These myths helped them understand their suffering, their place in the world, and the mysteries that surrounded them. To the peasant, these stories were a language of survival, a means of finding meaning in a world where meaning often seemed elusive. One of the most pervasive themes in these myths was the idea of hidden lands, lands that existed beyond the familiar world, places where the rules of life were different, where the harshness of reality could be escaped, if only for a brief moment. These lands were often depicted as places of power, beauty, and mystery, where ancient gods and heroes once walked. Some of these hidden realms were found deep within the forest, beyond the reach of the lords and priests, while others were imagined as distant shores, across vast, unexplored seas. They were places of longing, representing the desire for escape from the relentless toil of everyday life, and the peasants' hope that there might be something more, something better beyond the horizon. These myths were not just born from idle imagination. They were shaped by the peasants' real experiences, by the very landscapes they lived in and the hardships they endured. The forest, often seen as a place of mystery and danger, became a central element in many of these myths. In the forest, the peasants saw both a place of refuge and a world of untold dangers, a world where ancient spirits and forgotten creatures roamed, where the boundaries between life and death blurred. and where the secrets of the past were hidden from view. The stories they told about the forest were not simply about the supernatural. They were about survival, about understanding the natural world, and about the power of the land to either nurture or destroy. Similarly, the idea of powerful ancestors played a significant role in peasant myths. The peasants, whose lives were often dominated by the harsh realities of the present, looked to the past for strength. Their ancestors, who had fought wars, endured famines, and survived plagues, were seen as figures of power and wisdom. These ancestors were believed to possess knowledge that had been lost to time, knowledge of the earth, of survival, and of hidden forces that could shape the world. The peasants looked to these ancestral figures for guidance, for the strength to endure, and for the reassurance that they, too, could survive the trials of their time. The gods of these myths were often not the grand, omnipotent deities worshipped in the cathedrals, but gods tied to the earth, to the land, and to the forces of nature. These were gods of the harvest, of the moon and the sun, of the winds and the waters. They were gods who understood the hardships of life, who lived alongside the peasants in the fields and the forests, who knew the struggle of survival. These gods were not distant and removed, but present in the everyday struggles of life. They were gods who could be called upon for help, who could offer protection from disease, famine, and the wrath of the elements. But perhaps the most powerful of these myths were the stories of forgotten gods, gods whose names had been erased from history by the Church, but whose power was still believed to linger in the land. These gods were often depicted as rebellious, as figures who had once held dominion over the earth before being cast aside by the rise of Christianity. In the myths of the peasants, these gods were not gone. They were simply hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. These forgotten gods were the ones the peasants turned to in times of desperation, when the Church's promises of salvation seemed distant and empty. In these moments, the peasants believed that the old gods, the ones who had been cast aside, still had the power to protect them, to heal them, and to guide them through the darkness. The peasants' myths were a tapestry woven from their experiences, their hopes, and their fears. They were a reflection of a people who had little but their faith and their knowledge of the land to survive. These stories were their way of taking control of a world that often seemed out of their hands. They created a mythic universe where the forces of nature were not indifferent, but personal, where the land could be both a friend and a foe, and where the unseen world was as real and powerful as the one they could see and touch. These myths also served as a means of passing down knowledge, not just of the past, but of the future. The peasant stories were filled with lessons about survival, about the balance of nature, and about the importance of community. In these myths, the peasants saw reflections of their own lives, their own struggles, and their own victories. The ancient gods, the powerful ancestors, and the hidden lands were not just elements of folklore. They were the language through which the peasants understood the world and found their place within it. But as the centuries passed, these myths began to fade from the collective memory. The rise of Christianity and the consolidation of power by kings and nobles led to the suppression of these stories, and many of them were lost to time. The Church, eager to establish its dominance, sought to replace the old beliefs with its own, casting the myths of the peasants aside as heathen and pagan. Yet, for all the efforts to erase these myths, they endured. The peasants, who had woven these stories into the very fabric of their lives, continued to tell them in secret, preserving their knowledge and their connection to the land. As we move into the next section, we will explore how these myths influenced modern culture, how the stories of the peasants, once suppressed and forgotten, would later emerge as a powerful force in shaping art, literature, and the collective imagination. The myths of the peasants, though silenced for a time, would leave a legacy that continues to echo through the centuries. Their stories were never truly erased, they were simply waiting to be rediscovered. The echoes of the past are often hidden in plain sight. The myths, traditions, and practices passed down by medieval peasants, long dismissed as superstition or trivial, have left an indelible mark on our world today. These forgotten roots, shaped by generations of struggle, survival, and ingenuity, continue to influence modern society in ways we may never fully comprehend. Asterisk. What we've forgotten from the past is still alive in our modern world. Asterisk. The medieval peasants were not simply figures of the past, their lives erased in the history books. Their contributions, woven into the very fabric of human existence, continue to reverberate through our culture, our agriculture, and even our technology. It is in the way we grow our food, in the folk traditions we still observe, and in the way we understand our relationship with nature. These connections to the past are not always apparent, yet they shape the world we live in every day. Take, for example, the agricultural practices that form the foundation of our food system today. The peasants of medieval Europe, though they had no access to modern tools or techniques, were masters of the land. They understood crop rotation, the importance of maintaining soil health, and the value of biodiversity, long before these concepts became mainstream in modern farming. The ancient methods of planting and harvesting that they perfected over centuries passed down through oral tradition in the quiet corners of the village were the basis of the agricultural revolution that would follow. Today, as we face the challenges of sustainable farming and climate change, we are slowly rediscovering many of the techniques that peasants used to maintain the balance of nature. Their understanding of the earth, honed through necessity and hardship, continues to inform modern agricultural practices that prioritize sustainability, organic methods, and soil conservation. Similarly, the folk traditions that the peasants preserved have subtly influenced modern culture. The customs, rituals, and festivals that sprang from ancient beliefs continue to shape our celebrations and holidays. The patterns of seasonal festivals, rooted in the agricultural cycle, can still be seen today in the way we celebrate the changing of the seasons, from harvest festivals to the celebration of the solstices. These traditions, though often sanitized and repurposed by later generations, carry within them the ancient knowledge of the peasant's relationship with the land, the importance of the harvest, the reverence for the changing seasons, and the acknowledgement of the cycles of life and death. All of these were integral to the medieval peasant's worldview and have filtered through to modern celebrations, rituals, and even in the way we approach work and rest. The belief systems of the peasants, once dismissed as pagan or primitive, have also found their way into modern thought and practice. While much of the spiritual knowledge of the peasants was overshadowed by the rise of Christianity, their connection to nature and the spiritual world is still visible today in the growing interest in eco-spirituality, paganism, and New Age practices. The peasants' reverence for the earth, their belief in the sacredness of nature, and their understanding of the interconnectedness of all life have been carried forward into modern environmental movements. These movements, focused on ecological balance and sustainability, echo the ancient practices of the peasants who understood the importance of living in harmony with the land. But the impact of the medieval peasants is not confined to agriculture or spirituality. Their craftsmanship and practical knowledge have also left lasting traces in modern society. The art of building, passed down through generations of peasants, laid the groundwork for much of modern architecture. The same principles of construction, building with what the land provided, using local materials, and designing for functionality can still be seen in the way we construct homes and buildings today, particularly in sustainable architecture. The use of local resources, the adaptation to the environment, and the focus on durability, these were all skills honed by peasants over centuries and are now being rediscovered as we seek to build more sustainable and efficient structures. Even the simplest tools used by medieval peasants have left their mark on modern technology. The plough, the sickle, the wheelbarrow, these basic implements were the foundation of the agricultural system that allowed medieval society to function, but their influence extends beyond farming. The principles behind these tools, simplicity, efficiency, and adaptation to local needs, continue to inspire modern inventors and engineers. The same ingenuity that led peasants to fashion tools from the earth's raw materials is evident today in the way we create technology that is functional, accessible, and often rooted in natural principles. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the medieval peasants, however, lies in their resilience. In the face of overwhelming odds, In a world that seemed to care little for their survival, the peasants found ways to endure. Their stories, often passed down in silence, speak of a people who refused to be broken, who adapted, innovated, and fought for their place in a world that tried to erase them. This resilience, this ability to survive against all odds, has been passed down through generations, shaping not only the communities they built, but also the societies that came after. In times of hardship, in moments of crisis, the legacy of the peasant's strength continues to inspire those who face the seemingly insurmountable challenges of their own time. As we face the challenges of the modern world, from climate change to political instability, we find ourselves returning to some of the very principles that the peasants understood so well. We are beginning to realize that the answers to our most pressing problems are not always found in technology or industry, but in the ancient knowledge and practices that have been handed down through generations. The peasants, though forgotten by history, left behind a legacy that continues to shape our world. Their connection to the earth, their knowledge of survival, and their ability to adapt in the face of adversity are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how this legacy of resilience and survival continues to influence modern societies, and how the hidden contributions of the medieval peasants can still inform the way we live today. Their impact, though often unacknowledged, is undeniable, and it is a testament to the enduring power of those who, though forgotten by the history books, shaped the world in ways that continue to resonate. History, as it's often told, is a story of the powerful kings, queens, generals, and statesmen who stand in the light, their names etched into the annals of time. But beneath this surface narrative, there is another story, one that has always been hidden in the shadows. It is the story of the peasants, the laborers, the craftsmen, the farmers whose lives and struggles were largely ignored by official history. And yet, their influence on the world we know today is undeniable. Asterisk. What if the roots of our modern freedoms are hidden in the shadows of the medieval past? Asterisk. The fight for justice, equality, and basic human dignity didn't begin with the civil rights movements of the 20th century or the revolutions of the modern era. It began long before, in the fields, villages, and small communities where peasants, often oppressed and unheard, quietly shaped the course of history. Theirs was a struggle not just for survival, but for the right to live with dignity, to be seen as human beings rather than tools of the land. In their resistance, in their work, and in their enduring fight against the forces that sought to erase them, the peasants laid the groundwork for the struggles we see today. At the heart of the peasants' contributions to modern society lies their role in agriculture. The medieval peasants, with their intimate knowledge of the land, were the architects of agricultural practices that have evolved into modern farming techniques. From crop rotation to the domestication of animals, from the use of natural fertilizers to the development of tools that increased productivity, these innovations were born of the peasants' need to survive, not of academic study or theoretical research. Yet, over time, these simple yet effective practices formed the backbone of the agricultural revolution that would eventually allow societies to flourish. But the influence of the peasants extends beyond agriculture. In the very struggle for survival, they laid the foundation for movements that would champion equality, justice, and the rights of the marginalized. Their battles against the feudal system, against lords who controlled the land and dictated their lives, were the precursors to the larger fights for freedom that would unfold in the centuries to come. Their rebellions, often quiet and unnoticed, were not just about land or food, they were about power, about taking back control from those who sought to rule over them without mercy or regard for their lives. The peasants' resistance, their refusal to submit completely to the systems that oppressed them, gave rise to the ideas of democracy, equality, and rights that we hold dear today. It was in the face of their hardships that the seeds of social justice were sown, even if those seeds remained hidden for centuries. The peasants' struggle for autonomy, for the right to govern their own lives and land, resonates in the modern fight for civil rights and freedom. The demands of peasants for a fairer world, a world where their labor was respected and their voices heard, mirror the struggles of marginalized groups today who seek justice and equality. For generations, the peasants' role in history was obscured. Their contributions were dismissed as insignificant, their struggles written off as the inevitable lot of the poor. The powerful sought to erase their stories, to silence their voices, and to ensure that their influence was never fully understood. The kings and nobles, who chronicled history in their own image, saw no value in recording the lives of those who toiled in silence. But despite this, the legacy of the peasants endured, slipping through the cracks of official history to shape the world in ways that the powerful could never fully control. One of the most enduring legacies of the peasants was their role in the development of the concept of the commons. Long before the idea of public space or collective ownership emerged as a formal political theory, peasants practiced it in their daily lives. The communal land, the shared harvests, and the collective responsibility for the well-being of the village were all part of a broader understanding of justice and fairness. These communal values, rooted in the everyday lives of peasants, would eventually inspire modern ideas of democracy and social equity. The peasants understood, long before it became a widespread political ideal, that land and resources should belong to the community, not to a few powerful individuals. Moreover, the peasants' relationship with the church, a relationship that was both one of devotion and resistance, would influence the ongoing struggle for religious freedom. The church, in its power, sought to control the spiritual lives of the peasants, dictating what they could believe and how they could worship. But even as the peasants were taught to fear divine retribution, they found ways to practice their own beliefs, to continue the rituals and folk traditions that had long been a part of their lives. In this quiet subversion, they laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of religious tolerance, where individuals would have the right to practice their faith freely, without fear of persecution. The legacy of the peasants is also visible in the rise of labor movements that sought to challenge the power of the ruling elite. The labor unions of the 19th and 20th centuries, which fought for fair wages, better working conditions, and the right to organize, were in many ways the direct descendants of the peasant struggles. While the peasants may not have had formal unions, or the ability to organize in the way we understand it today, their demands for fair treatment, their desire for control over their own lives, and their fight against exploitation laid the foundation for modern labor movements. The history of the peasant rebellion is a history of the fight for workers' rights, a fight that continues to this day. But the story of the peasants' influence is not one of uninterrupted progress. While their struggles were vital in shaping the world we know, their stories have been suppressed and distorted by the powerful. For centuries, the records of their lives were ignored or rewritten, their contributions diminished or erased. As we look back, it's clear that the history we have been taught, the history of kings, battles, and conquests, is incomplete. The peasants were not mere bystanders in history. They were the ones who built it, who fought for it, and whose quiet strength continues to shape our world. As we turn to the next chapter, we will explore how these hidden stories have been deliberately erased or altered by official histories. The peasants' contributions have often been swept under the rug, their struggles marginalized in favor of narratives that favor the powerful. But as we begin to uncover these forgotten histories, we start to see the true impact of their struggle and how it continues to shape the fight for justice, equality, and freedom in our own time. For centuries, the story of history has been written by the victors, kings, queens, and the elites who sat on thrones, wielding power and authority. The peasants, the workers, the laborers, those whose backs bore the weight of the kingdom, have largely been left out of this narrative. Their stories of survival, rebellion, and resilience have been ignored, erased, or intentionally hidden. Official medieval chronicles, penned by royal scribes and powerful historians, often presented a view of the past that was sanitized, simplified, and skewed toward the interests of those in power. Asterisk. What if history has lied to us? What if the true story was buried beneath centuries of royal propaganda? Asterisk. The chronicles of the time tell the tales of kings' triumphs, the victories in battle, the treaties signed, and the grandiose lives of the nobility. These records, meticulously crafted by scribes in the service of the elite, painted a picture of medieval society that centered on the power of rulers and the glory of conquest. But what they didn't record, what they deliberately omitted, were the stories of the peasants. The men and women who worked the land, who fought invisible wars against disease and famine, whose rebellions were often small but significant. Their voices were silent in the official accounts. Why were the peasants' stories omitted? The answer lies in the control of knowledge. Those who held power understood the importance of controlling the narrative. By erasing the struggles of the working class, the elites could maintain the illusion of a stable and divine order, one in which the king ruled by divine right. The lords served as protectors of the people, and the peasants were simply there to labor. If the peasants' rebellions, their resistance, and their survival strategies were recorded, it would challenge this narrative, suggesting that the system was not as natural or inevitable as it appeared. It would show that the peasants were not mere victims but active agents, fighting for their rights, and sometimes even overthrowing their rulers in the most unexpected ways. The chroniclers of the time were not impartial observers of history. They were part of the elite, often working directly under the auspices of the monarchy or the church. Their records were shaped by political interests, designed to glorify the ruling class while suppressing any acknowledgement of the struggles of the common people. The tales of peasant uprisings, such as the Jacquerie Times in 1358, were downplayed or distorted. These uprisings, though powerful, were often portrayed as chaotic mobs or senseless violence, rather than as organized protests born out of years of exploitation and neglect. The true motives of these rebellions, the demands for justice, for fair treatment, and for the right to live with dignity, were lost in the official accounts. The omission of peasant stories also reflects the broader societal belief in the inherent hierarchy of medieval life. The feudal system was built on the idea that the nobles were born to rule and the peasants were born to serve. To question this order was to challenge the very structure of society. And so, those who lived outside the ruling class, those who questioned the status quo, were marginalized. Their contributions, their knowledge of the land, their craftsmanship, and their survival tactics were minimized or outright erased, because recognizing them would have undermined the legitimacy of the system. But these gaps in history are not just about the deliberate erasure of certain stories. They are about the shaping of collective memory, the creation of a narrative that serves the interests of the powerful. By leaving the peasants out of the historical record, the elites controlled what was remembered and what was forgotten. They ensured that the victories of kings, the glory of noble houses, and the divine right of rulers were the dominant narratives, while the struggles of the working class were relegated to the shadows. This manipulation of history was not just an accident, it was a carefully crafted strategy designed to maintain control and reinforce the idea that the system of power in place was natural and unchangeable. However, the peasant stories didn't vanish entirely. Even as the royal scribes silenced their voices in official records, the stories of resistance, rebellion, and resilience continued to circulate in the shadows. These stories were passed down orally, through songs, folk tales, and whispered accounts. They lived in the hearts and minds of those who had lived through the hardships of the medieval world. Over time, these stories would be rediscovered, not in dusty tomes or royal archives, but in the cracks of history, in the oral traditions of rural communities, in the folk songs that persisted long after the last of the feudal lords had passed from power. The peasants' resistance also found its way into the art and literature of the time, albeit in veiled forms. The medieval ballads, often sung by the common people, were filled with hidden meanings and allegories that spoke of rebellion, of standing up against oppressive rulers, and of the quest for justice. These ballads, passed from one generation to the next, carried the weight of the peasants' experiences and were a form of defiance against the silencing of their stories. Even the art of the time, in its depictions of suffering and hardship, often contained subtle critiques of the feudal system, suggesting that the world was not as just as it appeared in the royal chronicles. What we see, then, is a history that has been deliberately shaped, one that favors the perspective of the powerful and erases the stories of those who lived and died in the margins. The peasants, though they may not have had the power to write their own histories, created their own narratives in the spaces that the elites could not reach. These hidden histories have been lost for centuries, but they have never fully disappeared. They persist in the folklore, the traditions, and the knowledge that the peasants passed down, quietly shaping the world long after their voices were silenced in official records. As we look forward to the next section, we will explore the consequences of this historical erasure. We will examine how the suppression of peasant stories has shaped our understanding of the past, and how the recovery of these hidden histories can help us understand the struggles for justice and equality that continue today. The true legacy of the peasants, their resilience, their resistance, and their contributions to society, has been buried beneath layers of royal propaganda. But it is a legacy that still shapes our world, waiting to be rediscovered. When we erase a people's story from history, we don't just silence their voices, we erase their wisdom, their lessons, and their contributions to the world. The long-standing erasure of the peasant class from the historical record has had far-reaching consequences, not only in the way we understand the past, but also in the way we approach the present. The true cost of forgetting the peasants isn't just in the history books, it's in the world we live in today. For centuries, the peasants were portrayed as passive subjects, their struggles reduced to the backdrop of royal conquests, religious wars, and the actions of the nobility. The peasants were not seen as agents of change or contributors to the larger societal fabric. They were simply workers, their lives confined to the fields, their stories never fully told. But this erasure came at a steep price, not just for the peasants, but for society as a whole. By ignoring their contributions, we lost critical knowledge that could have shaped the development of agriculture, social systems, and even the very concept of justice. One of the most profound losses from this erasure is the valuable agricultural knowledge that the peasants held. The medieval peasants were, in many ways, the world's first sustainable farmers. Their deep understanding of crop rotation, soil preservation, and natural fertilizers was the foundation of the agrarian system that kept medieval society alive. They knew the land in ways that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate. They understood the intricacies of ecosystems, how to work with nature rather than against it, and how to maintain the balance necessary to feed a growing population. The peasants practiced techniques that are only now being rediscovered as the world grapples with the challenges of climate change and food security. Yet, this wealth of knowledge was largely forgotten or dismissed as primitive when more modern agricultural methods, often driven by the rise of industrial farming, took hold. The simple wisdom of the peasants, how to live in harmony with the land, how to preserve its fertility and biodiversity, was replaced with more exploitative and environmentally harmful practices. What we've learned in recent decades about the unsustainable nature of industrial agriculture and the importance of sustainable farming techniques is not a new discovery, but a rediscovery of ancient wisdom. If history had not erased the peasants' knowledge, we might have avoided many of the environmental crises we now face. Their understanding of the land could have led us to a more sustainable world decades ago. But it wasn't just agricultural knowledge that was lost. The peasants also held the keys to community-building practices that were deeply rooted in cooperation, mutual aid, and shared responsibility. In a society that was often fragmented, where the nobility lived in their castles, far removed from the everyday struggles of the common people, the peasants built communities that were based on necessity, but also on solidarity. They worked together to tend to the land, to protect one another from the ravages of disease, famine, and war. Their lives, though difficult, were sustained by a strong sense of interdependence. In these small, close-knit villages, the bonds of community were strong, and survival depended on cooperation. However, as the power of the elites grew, these communal practices were pushed aside in favor of individualism and hierarchies. The development of feudal systems, and later the rise of capitalism, led to the fragmentation of society. The collective spirit of the peasants, where everyone had a role and a stake in the well-being of the community, was replaced by systems that focused on profit and individual gain. Today, we live in a world that often feels disconnected, where community building has taken a backseat to personal success and competition. What if we had learned from the peasants and built our societies on a foundation of cooperation rather than competition? What if we had maintained the importance of communal responsibility and mutual support? Could we have avoided many of the societal divides that plague us today? But the erasure of the peasant stories didn't stop at knowledge or community. The loss of their voices also meant the loss of crucial historical lessons that could have helped shape a more just and equitable world. The peasants were not merely victims of history. They were active participants, resisting oppression, fighting for survival, and building the foundations of society from the ground up. Their rebellions, whether large or small, were cries for justice, for a fairer world, for a society where their labor was valued and their lives respected. Yet, their struggles were often dismissed, their victories downplayed or ignored by those in power. The true story of peasant resistance, from uprisings like the Jacquerie times to the quieter, everyday acts of defiance, could have informed our modern understanding of social justice, labor rights, and equality. By ignoring these histories, we lost a deeper understanding of the power of resistance. We were taught to look to grand revolutions or elite political movements as the only sources of change. But what if the true force for social change was not in the halls of power, but in the streets, in the fields, in the hearts of the oppressed? What if the peasants' quiet resistance, their refusal to submit to the crushing weight of oppression, held lessons that could have shaped more equitable social movements today? In the absence of these lessons, we have seen how the modern world has struggled to create truly just systems, while movements for civil rights, workers' rights, and social justice have made significant strides. They have often ignored the deep, systemic roots of oppression that date back to medieval times. The inequality of the feudal system, the exploitation of labor, and the control of land and resources by the powerful are patterns that continue to haunt us today. What if the stories of the peasants, their struggles for justice, and their wisdom about collective action had been remembered? Would we have been able to build a society that valued equality, shared resources, and justice for all? The erasure of the peasants has left us with more than just a gap in history. It has left us with the consequences of that gap, the loss of knowledge, the distortion of social values, and the absence of the very voices that could have shaped a different world. But the peasants' legacy is not entirely lost. Though their stories were erased from the official record, they persist in the cracks of history, in the traditions and movements that continue to seek justice. As we begin to uncover these forgotten histories, we can start to reclaim what was lost and use that knowledge to reshape the world we live in. In the next chapter, we will explore how recovering these lost pieces of history could change our understanding of the past and help us build a more equitable future. We will ask, what if we could recover these forgotten stories, these hidden truths, and start to reframe our understanding of history? The lessons of the peasants, their struggles, their wisdom, their resilience, can still guide us today, if only we are willing to listen. In the quiet corners of the world, beneath layers of earth, dust, and centuries of neglect, the truth about the peasants, their lives, their struggles, and their contributions remains hidden, waiting to be unearthed. For too long, their stories were buried beneath the grandiose narratives of kings and conquerors, erased from the official histories by the very powers that sought to control them. But today, modern historians, archaeologists, and cultural researchers are digging into the past, determined to recover what was lost, to rediscover the untold stories of those who built the world with their hands. What if the truth of the peasants is still hidden in plain sight, waiting to be unearthed? For generations, the voices of peasants have been drowned out by the loud, dominant narratives of the elite. The works of kings, queens, and nobles were meticulously recorded, their achievements chronicled in lavish manuscripts and stone monuments. Meanwhile, the lives of the common folk were left largely undocumented, their contributions unrecognized. But today, a new generation of scholars is challenging this erasure, turning their attention to the peasants whose stories were neglected, whose wisdom was buried beneath the weight of history. These modern efforts to rediscover the past are reshaping how we understand medieval society and, in doing so, revealing a more complex, nuanced, and human story of our ancestors. In recent decades, archaeologists have uncovered an astonishing wealth of information about the lives of peasants, shedding light on their art, their daily routines, and their hidden villages. The most surprising discoveries often come from unexpected places, from abandoned fields, forgotten ruins, and even the most humble of cottages. These excavations have revealed not just the physical remains of the peasants' lives, but also the intangible aspects of their culture, the things that once defined them but were lost to the official histories. One of the most significant discoveries has been the rediscovery of peasant art. For centuries, it was assumed that the peasants, being largely illiterate and without access to education, had little to contribute to the cultural landscape. But in recent years, archaeologists have unearthed intricate pottery, woven textiles, and even carvings and sculptures that show a vibrant artistic culture among the peasantry. These works of art, often created with simple tools and materials, reveal the peasants' deep connection to the land and to their everyday lives. The designs that decorated their pottery, the images they carved into wood or stone, were not just ornamental. They were expressions of their worldview, their spiritual beliefs, and their experiences. These artifacts are reshaping our understanding of medieval art, showing that beauty and creativity were not the exclusive domain of the elite, but were alive in the everyday lives of ordinary people. In addition to art, there has been a resurgence in the study of medieval diaries and written records kept by peasants themselves. Though literacy rates were low among the working class, there are surviving manuscripts, letters, and account books that offer a rare glimpse into the personal lives of peasants. These records, often dismissed as inconsequential by earlier historians, now provide invaluable insights into the peasants' experiences. Diaries and letters from peasants reveal the struggles they faced, the triumphs they celebrated, and the ways they adapted to a world constantly in flux. These written accounts offer a personal, intimate look at medieval life, challenging the portrayal of peasants as faceless masses and showing them instead as individuals with hopes, dreams, and unique perspectives. Perhaps one of the most profound discoveries in recent years has been the unearthing of entire hidden villages and ruins once thought lost to time. Modern archaeological methods, including ground-penetrating radar and advanced excavation techniques, have allowed researchers to locate the remnants of long-forgotten peasant settlements. These villages, often located in remote areas, were once thriving communities where peasants lived, worked, and raised families. Many of these villages were abandoned after disasters such as plagues, famines, or invasions, and their stories were lost. But now, through careful excavation, scholars are piecing together the lives of those who lived in these villages, reconstructing the buildings, the roads, and the tools that shaped their world. These discoveries are giving us a new understanding of peasant life, revealing the ways in which peasants organized themselves, how they interacted with one another, and how they built communities in a world where they were often left to fend for themselves. Modern technology has also allowed researchers to uncover peasant practices that were once only passed down orally. Oral traditions, which have long been a rich source of knowledge in peasant communities, are now being recorded and analyzed by cultural researchers. Folklore, songs, rituals, and customs that were thought to be lost are now being documented and preserved. These traditions, many of which have been handed down for generations, reveal how peasants viewed the world around them, their relationship to the land, to the seasons, to the spiritual forces that governed their lives. By examining these oral traditions, historians are uncovering a wealth of knowledge about peasant culture, their values, and their ways of coping with the hardships they faced. One of the most fascinating aspects of these discoveries is the way they challenge the traditional understanding of medieval society. In the past, peasants were often seen as passive figures, the recipients of history's cruelties but never its shapers. The new findings, however, reveal that the peasants were not just the subjects of history, but active participants in it. Their art, their written records, their communities, and their stories are a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. They did not simply survive. They created, adapted, and thrived in ways that have left an indelible mark on history. The rediscovery of these hidden histories also has a profound impact on how we view the modern world. The peasants' struggle for survival, their community-building practices, and their resistance to oppression are not relics of the past. They are lessons for the present. The way peasants built communities, worked the land, and resisted exploitation has direct implications for how we approach social justice, labor movements, and environmental sustainability today. The hidden histories of the peasants show us how societies can function in ways that prioritize cooperation and resilience, offering valuable insights for addressing modern challenges such as inequality, climate change, and political instability. The question we must now ask is, what if the truth of the peasants is still hidden in plain sight, waiting to be unearthed? What if, by recovering these lost stories, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own history and use that knowledge to create a more equitable future? As modern historians, archaeologists, and researchers continue their work, we are beginning to recover the voices of the peasants, the workers, the farmers, the laborers whose contributions have shaped our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. As we move into the next section, we will explore how these discoveries can reshape not just our understanding of the past, but our vision for the future. By uncovering the lost truths of the peasants, we may find that the lessons they left behind hold the key to a better, more just world. The past is not merely a collection of events and dates. It is a lens through which we can view the present and shape the future. As modern historians, archaeologists, and cultural researchers continue to uncover the lost histories of the peasants, we are given the opportunity to reframe our understanding of the past. By reclaiming these forgotten stories, we can begin to understand not just the lives of medieval peasants, but the broader societal implications of their struggles. These new insights can help us re-examine the foundations of modern class struggles, economic systems, and social movements, offering us the tools to address the inequities that persist in our world today. What if by looking into the forgotten past, we could shape a better future? The histories of peasants, long neglected and dismissed by mainstream narratives, offer a wealth of knowledge that can inform our understanding of modern society. By studying their experiences, we can see how the patterns of power, labor, and inequality that shaped medieval life continue to echo through the centuries. The peasant stories are not just a relic of a bygone era, they are a mirror reflecting the social and economic struggles we still face today. From the control of land and resources by elites to the exploitation of labor by the powerful, the dynamics of medieval society are strikingly similar to those in modern capitalist systems. The peasants' struggles were not just about survival, they were about asserting their dignity, their rights, and their power in a world that sought to erase them. In recent years, the resurgence of interest in peasant history has led to a broader reconsideration of the concept of class. For centuries, class struggles were viewed through the lens of industrialization, with a focus on factory workers, urban labor, and the rise of modern economies. But the lives of medieval peasants, their resistance, their community building, and their defiance in the face of oppression provide a deeper, more complex understanding of class dynamics. The peasants were the backbone of medieval society, yet they were treated as expendable, invisible, and voiceless. Their labor sustained the entire feudal system, but their voices were often silenced by those in power. As we uncover the history of their struggles, we begin to see that the roots of modern class inequality stretch back much further than we often realize. The struggle for social and economic justice is not a recent phenomenon. It is a struggle that has been ongoing for centuries, fought by those whose names have been forgotten, whose efforts have been obscured by the powers that be. By reclaiming the history of peasants, we can gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped our modern economic systems and social structures. The peasants were the first to resist feudal exploitation, to challenge the hierarchies of power that dictated their lives. Their actions, from uprisings to subtle forms of resistance, laid the groundwork for later movements for workers' rights, civil rights, and social change. By understanding the full scope of medieval peasant life, we can see the ways in which their resistance informs the ongoing struggles for justice today. One of the most significant implications of this newfound history is the way it can reshape our understanding of modern economic systems. The feudal system, with its reliance on the exploitation of peasants' labor and the concentration of land and resources in the hands of a few elites, bears striking similarities to modern capitalist economies. In both systems, wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of people are forced to work long hours for little reward. The peasants' resistance to this system, their demands for a fairer world, and their struggles for autonomy are not just historical events, they are lessons for us today. By reclaiming their stories, we can begin to question the systems that perpetuate inequality in our own time, and challenge the economic structures that benefit only a select few, while leaving the rest of us to struggle. Furthermore, by understanding the social dynamics of medieval peasant life, we can gain insight into the ways in which modern social movements are shaped. The peasants' efforts to create communities based on mutual aid, cooperation, and solidarity offer a blueprint for modern movements that seek to address inequality and social injustice. Today, movements for social justice, workers' rights, and environmental sustainability are often grounded in principles of collective action and community building. These movements draw on the same values that were integral to peasant life, the belief that we are stronger together, that our collective action can bring about change, and that we must resist systems that seek to divide us and exploit our labor. But the peasants' contributions were not just about resistance, they also laid the foundation for the creation of a more equitable society. By working the land, developing agricultural techniques, and passing down knowledge of the natural world, the peasants ensured that the land remained productive and that future generations would have access to the resources they needed to survive. They understood the importance of sustainability, of working in harmony with the land rather than exploiting it for short-term gain. These practices, many of which were lost or disregarded during the Industrial Revolution, are now being rediscovered as we grapple with the environmental crises of our own time. By reclaiming the knowledge of medieval peasants, we can begin to develop more sustainable practices that honor the land and its resources, rather than depleting them. The process of reclaiming these hidden histories also has profound implications for modern identity and social consciousness. As we uncover the stories of the peasants, we begin to recognize their resilience, their creativity, and their power. We see that they were not simply victims of history, but active agents who fought for their rights, their land, and their communities. This realization can inspire a new sense of pride and agency among modern social movements, reminding us that change is possible, that, like the peasants, we too have the power to resist oppression and shape the world around us. The question we now face is, what if we could recover those lost pieces of history and start to reframe our understanding of the past? What if we could look back at the lives of the peasants, their struggles, their contributions, their wisdom, and use that knowledge to create a better, more just world? By reconnecting with the forgotten histories of those who came before us, we can begin to see that the fight for justice, equality, and sustainability is not new. It is an ongoing struggle, one that has been fought for centuries by people whose stories have been lost, but whose legacy continues to shape the world today. As we move forward, we will explore how this process of historical recovery can influence the future. The next chapter will look at the key takeaways from this journey, and how we can use the lessons of the past to guide us toward a more equitable and just future. The peasant stories have much to teach us, and by embracing them, we may find new pathways to change, renewal, and progress. The peasants of the medieval world, though their lives were often ignored and their stories erased, left behind a legacy that still resonates today. Their struggles, their resilience, and their fight for justice reverberate through modern history, connecting the dots between the past and the present. The peasant stories may have been forgotten, but their influence is all around us. To understand how the lives of medieval peasants continue to shape the world we live in, we must look beyond the surface of history and draw the connections between their struggles and the issues we face today. The peasants were not just passive figures toiling away in the fields. They were active agents in the fight for justice, fighting against a system that sought to exploit and oppress them. Their struggles, their resistance to exploitation, their fight for a fairer world are the roots of modern labor movements, social justice causes, and the ongoing fight for equity. When we think about the labor struggles of today, it's easy to draw a direct line between the workers in medieval fields and the factory workers, service workers, and laborers of the modern world. The exploitation of labor is a thread that runs through history, from the peasants who worked the land under feudal lords to the modern-day workers who fight for better wages, working conditions, and basic rights. In both eras, the working class is at the mercy of powerful elites, whose wealth and privilege are built on the backs of those who perform the labor. The peasants fight against the feudal system for better living conditions, for fair treatment, and for the right to have a voice in their own lives is echoed in the struggles of today's labor unions, workers' rights movements, and calls for a living wage. The story of the peasants is, in many ways, the story of every marginalized group that has fought for recognition and dignity. Just as peasants were ignored and treated as disposable, modern-day marginalized communities face similar struggles. Whether it's the fight for racial justice, gender equality, or LGBTQ+ rights, the peasants' fight for a more equitable world has parallels in every social justice movement today. Their fight for justice was not just about land or food, it was about recognition, about humanity, about being seen as people worthy of respect and dignity. This struggle continues today in movements that seek to dismantle systems of oppression, to build a world where everyone has access to the same rights and opportunities. One of the most profound ways the peasant story connects to the present is through the ongoing fight for equity in modern societies. The peasants lived in a world that was rigidly stratified, where the wealthy and powerful controlled the land, and the poor had little to no say in their own futures. Though we've moved far from the feudal system, the class divides that existed in medieval society still persist today. In modern capitalism, wealth and power remain concentrated in the hands of a few, while the working class continues to struggle to make ends meet. The peasants fought for their rights in a world that was structured to oppress them. Today, we continue to fight against systems that perpetuate inequality and marginalization. In fact, the peasants' lost legacies have much to teach us about addressing modern issues of economic disparity. The medieval system, with its rigid hierarchies and entrenched class distinctions, bears striking similarities to modern systems of economic inequality. Just as the peasants were forced to work the land and give up a portion of their harvest to their lords, today's workers are often forced to work long hours for wages that do not reflect the value of their labor. The peasant rebellions, which sought to challenge the system of feudal control, are the early seeds of the labor movements that would rise in the industrial era and beyond. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the push for workers' rights, better conditions, and the demand for a system that recognizes the dignity of labor. The peasants' influence can also be seen in the rise of collective action. Though they lacked the formal tools of protest that we now associate with labor movements such as unions or political parties, the peasants found ways to resist. They engaged in small-scale acts of defiance, sabotaging crops, hiding food, refusing to work, or organizing protests against unjust taxes. These acts of resistance may have been small, but they were powerful. They were the building blocks of modern collective action, teaching us that even in the most oppressive of systems, people can organize, resist, and demand change. Today, social movements continue to draw on this collective spirit, from labor strikes to climate change protests, as people come together to demand justice, equity, and change. The connection between the peasants' past and the present can also be seen in the environmental struggles of today. The peasants, with their deep knowledge of the land, were not only workers but stewards of the environment. They understood the rhythms of the earth, the importance of maintaining balance with nature, and the dangers of overexploitation. Their sustainable farming practices such as crop rotation, natural fertilizers, and community-based land management are lessons that we are only beginning to rediscover today. As modern societies grapple with climate change and environmental degradation, we can look to the peasants for guidance on how to live in harmony with the earth, rather than exploiting it for short-term gain. Their deep connection to the land reminds us of the importance of sustainability, community-based solutions, and responsible resource management. But perhaps the most profound way in which the peasants' legacy connects to the present is through the ongoing fight for social and economic justice. The peasants' struggles were not just about fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for a more just world, one where labor was valued, where communities were built on mutual support, and where the wealth of the land was shared more equitably. Today, we continue to fight for these same values. The struggles of the peasants for fairness, equality, and recognition are the same struggles that drive social movements today. From the fight for a living wage to the demand for universal healthcare, from racial justice to environmental justice, the peasants' fight for a more just society is still alive in the movements of our time. In drawing these connections, we begin to see that the peasants' forgotten histories are not just part of the past, they are part of our present and our future. Their struggles, their knowledge, and their resistance continue to shape the world we live in today. By understanding their role in shaping history, we can begin to understand how we can shape a better, more equitable future. Their legacy is not lost. It is alive, waiting to inspire the next generation to continue the fight for justice, equality, and a better world. As we conclude this journey, we are left with a powerful question. What can we learn from the forgotten history of the peasants, and how can we apply these lessons to the struggles of today? The answers lie not only in the past but in the future we choose to build. As we close this journey through history, we are left to ponder the profound lessons hidden in the struggles of medieval peasants. These were people whose names were lost to time, whose contributions were erased by the narratives of the powerful. Yet, despite the centuries that have passed, the echoes of their lives reverberate through the world today. Their struggles were not only about survival, but about dignity, about challenging the systems that sought to oppress them, and about building communities from the ground up. In the stories we've erased, lies the truth we need to hear. The peasant's legacy challenges us to rethink the way we view labor and value. In a world where wealth and power are still concentrated in the hands of a few, the labor of the many is often undervalued. The peasants worked the land, built homes, raised families, and sustained entire societies with their hands, yet they were treated as invisible, their lives seen as expendable. The modern world has made significant strides in recognizing workers' rights, but the core struggle of the peasants to be treated with dignity, to be seen and heard, continues in the labor struggles of today. From farm workers to factory laborers, from healthcare workers to service industry employees, the fight for fair wages, decent working conditions, and respect for one's labor is as relevant today as it was in the medieval era. What, then, can we learn from the peasants' lives? Their struggle for justice was not just about asking for better conditions, it was about asserting their humanity. In a world where they were considered mere tools of production, the peasants fought for their right to be recognized, to be seen as more than the sum of their labor. This demand for dignity transcends time and class. It speaks to the heart of the human experience, the desire to be acknowledged for who we are, not just for what we produce. It asks us to consider, how do we value work? And do we truly value the people who perform that work? The peasants' ability to build communities out of necessity also offers us a powerful lesson in solidarity. Living in a world where the powerful few controlled the land, the peasants had to rely on each other to survive. Their strength came not from individualism, but from their ability to work together, to share resources, to look after one another. In this sense, they built a social fabric that was rooted in mutual aid, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Today, as we face global challenges, from climate change to political instability to economic inequality, the lessons of community and collective action are more vital than ever. The struggles of medieval peasants remind us that true strength comes not from isolation, but from standing together. Moreover, the peasants' resistance to oppression, even in its most subtle form, speaks to the power of quiet defiance. The history books may not record their revolts, but the peasants resisted in countless ways, from small acts of sabotage to covert rebellions. They refused to simply accept their lot. In doing so, they showed us that resistance doesn't always have to be loud or violent to be powerful. Sometimes, the most effective acts of defiance are those that fly under the radar, challenging systems from within, slowly chipping away at the foundations of injustice. This kind of quiet resistance continues today in movements that may not always make the headlines, but that are making a real, lasting impact on society. Movements like the fight for racial equality, the push for environmental justice, and the growing demand for workers' rights. Perhaps the most profound lesson we can take from the peasants is the importance of remembering those who built the world from the shadows. For centuries, the stories of peasants were silenced, erased, or ignored. Yet, by recovering these stories, we not only honor their memory, but we gain valuable insights into the systems of power that have shaped our world. History is not just about remembering the great kings and battles, but about acknowledging the lives of those who made it all possible. In their forgotten histories, we find the keys to understanding how we got to where we are, and how we might move forward. The struggles of the peasants may seem far removed from our modern lives, but in truth, their experiences are woven into the very fabric of our society. The peasants' fight for justice and equality was not just a historical struggle. It is a struggle that continues today in the ongoing battles for workers' rights, social justice, and environmental sustainability. Their resilience, their community spirit, and their refusal to submit to oppression are qualities that we can still draw upon as we face our own challenges. By understanding their legacy, we are not just learning about the past, we are learning how to build a more just, equitable future. As we reflect on the lessons of the past, we must also consider the role that history plays in shaping the future. History is not just a record of what has happened, it is a guide for what is yet to come. The stories we choose to remember and those we choose to forget have the power to shape our world. The peasants' history was buried for so long, but it is now being rediscovered. In the process, we are reshaping our understanding of society, labor, and justice. The peasants' silent legacy teaches us that no struggle is too small to matter, and that even the quietest acts of resistance can have a lasting impact. As we conclude this documentary, we are left with one final question. Asterisk. What can we learn from the peasants' struggles, and how can we apply their lessons to the world we live in today? Asterisk. The answers are not just buried in the past, they are alive in the world around us, waiting to be rediscovered and acted upon. The peasants may have been forgotten, but their influence is all around us. And as we continue to uncover their stories, we realize that the lessons they left behind are more important than ever. Their struggles are not just the struggles of the past, they are the struggles of today and tomorrow. And it is through remembering them that we can begin to shape a better future for all. As we draw this journey to a close, we are left with the undeniable truth that the peasants, though often forgotten by history, shaped the very world we live in today. Their stories, their struggles, and their resilience are not just part of the past. They are the foundation of the present and the future. The lives of those who toiled in the shadows of kings and queens may have been erased from the official records, but their contributions have always been there, quietly influencing every facet of society. It is time we recognize and honor the legacies of those who built the world with their hands, whose work sustained kingdoms and empires, whose resistance to oppression sowed the seeds of justice and equality. As we re-examine history from the perspective of the peasants, we come to understand that their lives were not just about survival, they were about dignity, community, and the fight for a fairer world. Their art, their knowledge, and their resistance to exploitation are threads that run through every social justice movement, every fight for workers' rights, and every struggle for equality. The challenges they faced and the ways they fought back continue to echo in the lives of modern laborers, activists, and marginalized communities. By understanding the full scope of medieval peasant life, we not only gain a deeper appreciation for their struggles, but we also find guidance for how we can build a more inclusive, compassionate future. The lessons the peasants left behind are not just historical, they are timeless. In their stories of quiet resistance, in their communal spirit, and in their fight for fairness, we find lessons that can inspire the movements of today and tomorrow. Their experiences remind us that even the smallest acts of defiance can change the world, that community and solidarity are more powerful than division, and that the fight for justice is not a new struggle, but one that has been fought for centuries. So, as we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, let us not forget the peasants who lived and died in the shadows. Let their legacy serve as a reminder that history is not just written by the powerful, it is shaped by the everyday people, whose names are not etched in stone, but whose actions have a lasting impact on the world. As we carry forward their stories, we carry forward their wisdom, their strength, and their vision for a better world. And in doing so, we honor the peasants, who in their silent struggle have shown us the way forward. By re-examining history from their perspective, we have the chance to create a more inclusive and compassionate future, one where the voices of all people, no matter their status or station, are heard and valued. The peasants' legacy, long buried, is now waiting to be carried into the future, and it is up to us to ensure that their stories are never forgotten again.